I don't know about you, but I am tired. With everything that's going on in the world right now, I'll be honest, I'm finding myself impatient, angry, and really struggling to stay engaged. These days, it really doesn't take a lot to make me cry. My heart is already so tender. I am so ready for something new. I say something new, but maybe what I mean is something else. I want that peace God promises to be here now. How about you? The other night, I was walking home from the train, and I looked up in the sky, and I saw Orion's belt, and my whole heart just broke with grief. See, I closed my eyes, and I was immediately transported to my parents' driveway in the hills of Southern California. Crickets chirping, cold, crisp night air, an old orange truck parked next to a basketball hoop that my grandparents bought us one year for Christmas. And so many stars. And I held that memory tight behind half-closed eyelids as I walked home because I was desperate to live in a moment that felt safe and warm and like home. But my parents have sold that house. They actually live in a completely different state. And so do I. And this is a different time, and I am necessarily a different iteration of myself. But it made me think about the things we cling to when it feels like things are falling apart. Who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it not seem to you like nothing? The people to whom Haggai is preaching in our text this morning have been through a lot. It's been 67 years since Babylonian troops came storming into Jerusalem, tore down Solomon's temple, and exiled the Judean leadership. It took 50 years for them to get back to Jerusalem. And when they do, everything is different. They have survived, but the thriving kingdom they once knew is gone. And the political situation, though better than it was, is not everything they could have hoped for. It is still full of unrest. And some people are beginning to prosper, but most of them still lack this and are struggling with the day-to-day necessities of life. There's a lack of food, clothing, stable shelter. Poverty and violence are ever-looming specters. Yet it is to these people that Haggai had just 1 month earlier prophesied, urging the building of a new temple. And clearly he struck a chord, because by the time we get to our text this morning, the foundation has been laid. I am not certain how much you know about construction methods in 500 BCE, but let's say that's not an insignificant achievement. Still, all is not well on the construction site. They're building, but the work is hard. The issues on the outside world are still as present as they were, and that new prophecy energy is kind of faded. People are beginning to complain. In Ezra's accounting of this process, he tells us that people are looking at the foundation and weeping. They look at the structure as it is, and their hearts break because it seems so far from the glory of Solomon's temple, with its cedar panels, its gold inlay, the choicest of stones, the Ark of Covenant. How can this meager structure ever hope to compare? And can you blame them? Have you ever felt like that? Like you're working so hard and being so diligent, but everything feels like it's stacked against you, and the progress is not what you were hoping for. And haven't we all found ourselves in those moments wishing for a time when things felt more certain? The past can be a wonderful refuge when the present isn't going so well. And it must have been so hard to start again, especially in the face of decades of trauma and mistrust, and in particular, terrifying to even think about rebuilding when the popular understanding of the day was that God had allowed the first temple to be destroyed because the people had been faithless in their covenant. What if they failed again? And let's be really clear that this particular brand of theology is in no way confined to the history books. How many of us carry scars of being told that what's happening is no one's fault but our own? You broke covenant with God and now you're being punished. You were unfaithful, so God is abandoning you and you're going to pay the price. Or God just doesn't love people like you. But the text this morning speaks right into that fear and names it for the lie that it is. What God actually says to these grieving people is, I am with you. This is what I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt, and my spirit remains among you. Do not fear. In a little while I will once more shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. I will shake all nations, and what is desired by all nations will come, and I will fill this house with glory. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house. And in this place I will grant peace. In this moment that feels like despair and failure and brokenness and chaos, Haggai reaffirms God's promise to God's people, reminding them of the past and redirecting their focus to the future. Haggai reminds them that the temple may have been magnificent and imposing, a triumph of architecture and wealth, but it was God's presence in it that made the temple holy. And it is God's covenant that will bring forward a time of wholeness and peace. But there's another promise in the text. Did you catch it? Yes, God is bringing peace, but before that happens, God will shake the heavens and the earth. And you better believe that's going to cause some chaos. It's uncomfortable, isn't it? We really don't like to think of God as responsible for chaos. There it is in the text. The heavens and the earth, the sea and the land, all the nations shifting, cracking, being broken apart and completely reordered by divine intent. God promises us that things are going to break. But if we have faith in God's faithful covenant, then I think the scripture requires us to reconsider our perspective. In the context of this promise, upheaval clearly isn't a punishment, and it isn't some happenstance that God just hovers around but doesn't get involved with on the regular. Rather, the text suggests the moments in our lives that are filled with doubt and change are not separate from God, but rather an integral part of God's process. Because in some ways, seeing things as chaos says more about us than it does about God. It's a perspective problem. German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer said, "Every person takes the limits of their own field of vision for the limits of the world." Have you ever taken the limits of your own field of vision for the limits of what God can do? Yes, we are living in a hot mess time. Yes, things are cracking and shifting and changing, and some things are falling apart. And standing in the middle of it, it is so easy to only see chaos. But to surrender our hope to despair in those moments is to forget that God's possibility is greater. To fixate on some rosy vision of the past is to ignore that in the very beginning, there was also chaos. And out of that, God created the heavens and the earth. Without chaos, there can be no creation. And sometimes the old things have to break in order for something new to happen. The people who are standing and weeping for Solomon's temple are so caught up in this story of the past that they've lost sight not only of what made the temple special in the first place, but also how problematic it was. Solomon's temple was built on the backs of people forced into labor at tremendous cost to the country, sent Judea spiraling into debt to the point that they literally gave away entire cities to pay what they owed. And the scholars tell us that what those weeping people could not possibly have known, standing there, tethered to their nostalgia, was that whereas the first temple was credited to Solomon and built with forced labor, ultimately the second temple was a work of the people themselves. The actual builders were Judeans, who also unilaterally vowed to maintain it, and ultimately the second temple would occupy a greater place in Judean life than Solomon's temple ever had. When we choose to lean only on our own understanding, we separate ourselves from the full scope of God's vision and infinite possibility. Where are the places in your life that feel like they're breaking? What temples are you clinging to? And what would it mean to let them go? What would it look like to live fully into the assurance that God is not only present in the places that feel like chaos, but that in fact God will use chaos to issue forth a new creation? What would we do then? The answer, I think, is that we would put that faith into action and go to work. If we believe God's promise that the glory of this present house, which maybe looks like rubble right now, will be greater than the glory of the former house, then we must also show up and do the work, because we are called to be God's hands and feet in the world, a people who live and work in service of God's promise that there will be peace in this place. In the face of doubt, in the face of fear, in the face of a political and cultural climate that feels uncertain and out of control, the work we do when we show up and say yes to God is an active expression of our faith in what God can do at any moment. When we show up faithfully and do the work, not just on our own, but also in community with each other, that work becomes worship. And we open our hearts and minds to the expansive, unpredictable wonder of a God who looks at our present chaos and generates a new and glorious creation. Aren't you ready for a new world? A world where Black lives matter? A world where everybody's body is something to be celebrated and honored? Where having clean water and shelter and food are a foregone conclusion. Where todos los gentes tienen respeto y cosas suficientes para vivir y prosperar. Where sacred lands stay sacred, and we are all stewards of the earth. Where our children can go to school and play in parks and walk down streets, and we are not afraid for their lives. That is the world God promises us. And if we believe it, then we have to show up and work. We have to show up and make the sandwiches. We have to show up and dedicate our resources. We have to show up and educate ourselves about the issues. We have to show up and learn another language. We have to show up and make space for someone who doesn't look like us. We have to show up and organize. We have to show up and march. We have to show up and vote. Because right now, the things that are breaking and shifting and changing, I think it's because it's time for them to break. And this tumult, this chaos, this dis-ease, this is a sign of the world reforming. And we are called to such a time as this. So let's get to work.